Good morning, everybody. It's Mr. Forshee. Again, thanks for your patience during this time I'm going through recovery. My recovery's been a little bit slower than I thought, so I've trying to get back on the mend here, but I'm hoping to start catching up on my grading here in the next couple of days. I am feeling a little bit better, but I just still need time to recover with this leg. I've only been not even a full week out yet, so this is, I think, day 5 after my surgery. And they say this is where hopefully I can start to pick up on my recovery process. But what I want to do is talk to you about the class notes today. Class notes is on photosynthesis. You'll have a quiz on Monday with this. And just knowing some of the basics, some of the assignments you guys have completed, I have started grading those. They look pretty good. I'm going to keep this real general for the quiz, but you just kind of want to know the overall picture. What is photosynthesis? Now, don't worry about cellular respiration. We'll talk about that at a later date, but it is kind of a full circle because, plants are capable of doing both. We only perform that as cellular respiration. We cannot perform photosynthesis. But one of the things here I want to kind of show is this picture of this beautiful kind of tree here. It's got the sun shining on it. You got this kind of glowing green on the top. Well, the reason it's a glowing green is that the light coming in from the light spectrum, Roy G. Biv, has different wavelengths that have different energy within those wavelengths. And what happens is the plant doesn't absorb all those wavelengths. So the ones that it primarily absorbs is going to be a blue and a red. And you could see the one that it doesn't really absorb very well is green. And that's why we're getting a green picture with this. So when you guys look outside, I'm looking outside my window right now, and the trees are very, there's not a lot of green out there. And the reason is once that chlorophyll that kind of gives that tree that green color starts to break down, it kind of releases those other colors that we haven't seen. So that's why we get the oranges and the reds and the different colors that show up in those fall leaves, is because that chlorophyll can't do its job anymore. So again, we're going to kind of focus on this right here and kind of look at reason why. So, all life needs to have an energy input. So, through natural selection, years of evolving, we had to figure out a way to put energy into a body system. Well, we're considered heterotrophs, so we ingest our food, and so that means we have to consume it. So we have a cow here that's going to eat grass, but the cow can't produce its own energy source. It's got to get it from somewhere else. But plants are unique, and they are considered autotrophs, and they're going to do this through photosynthesis, or something that's called chemosynthesis. So photosynthesis is what we're going to focus on for the quiz. And then the chemosynthesis is not going to be on the quiz, okay? So that's something we see in the oceans, that plants can sometimes use sulfur or some other type of chemical in the ocean to transfer into an energy source. We'll talk about that actually when we do our otter unit coming up around that of the holidays. Now, so why do the plants need photosynthesis? Well, this is how they can produce their main compound is glucose, so C6H12O6. So you can see there's quite a bit of bond energy in here. So that's what's primarily happening. So you could think of this as like your gas for a car. A car will not run without gas, so you got to have, electric power for the car to drive if it's electric. Body systems are no different. If you have no energy going in, and if you've ever had to fast or not eat for a while, or you've skipped a couple meals because you haven't felt well, is you would see that your energy requirements are a little bit lower. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. So you can see kind of the food chain, the way it starts up. This is really the starting point. And you can see we have the primary consumers, secondary, tertiary, and then we have the final consumers and decomposers. So, but our main focus right now is going to be here at the sun to the plants. So how does this work exactly? This is actually a very complex system. It requires quite a bit of chemistry with this, because you have these different electrons that kind of get excited from the light rays. Those of you that take AP Bio will go into this a great deal. But for this class, I just want you to know the general overall structure in terms of how this works and kind of know exactly How it works, intricate parts, you guys can read about that later. I put some video clips in the folder today for you guys to look at. That's sometimes the best way to learn this too. But just know for this part in the quiz next week, it's just pretty general of like, so where does a plant get its energy from? What's it do with that energy? And then where can we, how does that plant grow from that energy? So we learned about that with the mitosis lab that we did in class. Now here's the big thing. So this is going to be in your quiz. Know this. This is on the quiz several different ways. Is remember we have something that's called a product. Oops. I said that backwards, sorry. A reactant and product. So the reactant and product, we have water, CO2, in the form of a gas. That's why we have the balloon there. And then we have the glucose molecule, and then we have that of the gas of oxygen. So you can see the flow of this. Now, if we were to go backwards on this, that would be the cellular respiration one that you guys did as an activity yesterday. So there's kind of a balance between the two. So this is why we talked in class, about, having plants in a classroom or into a high school, the air quality would simply be better. There'd be a higher supply of oxygen. You have all those people in there pulling in those oxygen molecules, dispensing CO2. The plants would probably grow pretty well because of the high rate of CO2 in those classrooms. So if you feel a little lethargic or you're like kind of blah, studies have shown the kind of air quality is a big part of that. So maybe it's something we could address down the road. Now, with writing out the equation, I won't ask you to do that, but I just need you to kind of know how this works. So you can remember that there's a balance in here. So if you notice that each of these letters represents, like, this is an atom of carbon, and there are going to be 6 carbon atoms here. Now, if you notice, this is a balance equation because the laws of thermodynamics says that matter is not created nor destroyed, but we can see there's also 6 carbons on the other side. So there's 6 carbons here, 6 carbons here, and then you can count on each side, and you would see there's an exact amount of each one of those atoms. So just kind of be aware, that's kind of a question I could ask you. So if you look here, like there's 6 waters molecules with 6 carbon dioxides, it's just kind of a way. I know you guys haven't had chemistry yet, but, I could ask you a couple of questions about that. Now, where does this all take place? Well, this is why we look at the plants, and we'll look at plants further down the road too. Once I get back into class, there's a couple of more microscope labs we'll look at with plants, and again, we're going to try to get those plants kind of fired up by putting them underneath a good light source, and that creates the right wavelength, and we can kind of see how they can really, really kind of brighten up. But really what's happening here, and this is what they kind of look like underneath the microscope, if you see these little circles, that's what we're looking at. That's giving that green pigment. That's the chloroplast. So the chloroplast here is what we could see on the side is the area that's going to absorb those wavelengths. Now, you can see how they're kind of stacked up here. Those are called thylakoids, and the lumen is the part that's around it. So like this here, they're like little discs that are kind of stacked like pennies on top of each other. And those are what are called the thylakoids. But inside of them are different pigments, and each pigment is unique to absorbing a particular part of the light spectrum. So why doesn't it absorb all the light spectrum? Well, again, UV can be dangerous and also harmful to DNA or to cellular growth. So we try to modify, and again, this is what I had to figure out through evolution means, that it doesn't need to absorb all of them. It just needs to absorb some of them. And that's why we get those different array of colors that come from different plants. But you can see the plant cell components here. Chloroplast is the really big one. You can see there's several of them. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. So that could be kind of a quiz question I ask you is like how many chloroplasts are there in there? So you want to know the kind of the general structure of these. It kind of looks like a bean, and inside the bean there looks like there's stacks of pennies, okay? Now, when we look at photo is just light, and then synthesis is to make something. So in this case, we're making glucose. So this is a really good image here to kind of show you what those thylakoids look like. and the lumens that go around it. But you can see what's going in. So these are the reactant, and these are the products. Okay. Now this part here, again, is just looking at the leaf system. This is kind of a good quiz question. So you guys did this on raw materials in the plant lab, or questions I gave you guys. But you could see here is the sun light is going into the leaf, and then that of the water is going through the root system. And then the CO2, if you remember, the CO2 goes under the plant because the stomata is on the underside of the leaf. So I will ask you a couple questions of that. I could put a picture of a stomata up there and then ask you, like, what is this? What's its primary purpose? But it's kind of like the door that allows the gases in and out. And then you can see here that what's going to happen is O2 is going to leave the plant. So again, we have that sunlight going in, we have the water going in, and the CO2. Then what's going out is that of the oxygen. Now what stays in here are going to be the sugars. So here's a C6H12O6. And again, that can run down into the plant system, or it can stay in that of the leaf. So if you're a herbivore and you're pretty hungry, like you could see like the deer in our neighborhood eat a lot of the plants during the summertime, that's where they're getting a lot of their primary source. Like lilies are one thing they love to eat. There must be something in that plant that has a lot of nutrients. I always seem to target those. But they don't eat sometimes the whole plant. They only eat parts of the plant because those are the parts that are probably most nutritious for it. Okay, so here's the question is, where does a tree or plants get its mass? So just think about this a second. So there's a video I'm going to show you guys will watch that will show like graduate students, adults, a lot of people get this question wrong, is they think they get it from the soil. Plants do not get their mass from the soil. So there's a famous experiment that went with this. And, you know, in my college courses, we talked about this too, for scientific design. So if you're going to go into research or go into some type of science, this is kind of Van Helmont was one of the ones that kind of set the precedent of like, how do you design a good scientific experiment? So you have, you know, limited variables, you have one thing you're focusing on, and again, you're seeing if by taking something away or adding something, like what is the part that's driving this change? Because remember, human nature has always been pretty curious. Now, for this one here, you could see that you have Van Helmont here looking at a bucket or a kind of a barrel with a tree in it. But where does he get it from? So most people would say it comes from the soil. That is going to be wrong here. So as a scientist, what he did is he took a bucket of soil for 5 years. He watered it and only lost a couple ounces of soil. Since the soil provided the water to the plant, he disproved that the plant ate the soil. So plants don't eat soil to gain their mass. Now, some people still don't believe this is a possibility, but there is one thing behind where a tree does get its mass. So like, here's a good example. I know this is a little blurry here, but you could see that before we have a willow that weighs 5 pounds. The amount of dirt is 200 pounds. So that's on day one. So after, again, 5 years, we have now the tree weighs 169. So we've had a huge increase. But look at my soil mass. My soil mass is about the same. And again, there's a slight decrease in weight, but it's almost exactly the same. But look at the size of my plant now. So where did that plant get its mass from? And if you guys said CO2, you were correct. So CO2, believe it or not, that plant consuming that CO2 is the way that tree mass is going to develop its size. So here's a great example. Here is CO2 plant food. Here is what happened with more CO2. So you can see the person down here adding this. So this is parts per million. That's what this stands for. So we have 385, 535, 685, and 835. But as they increase the parts per million of the CO2, look at what happens to the mass of the tree. It grows significantly. So this is why I said that if I ask you a question on a quiz, like why would a plant grow well in a classroom that has 100 students or 1,000 students? Well, the more students you have, the more CO2 gets produced. And again, the more that plant can take and feed and develop its mass. So by having this gas can build glucose, which stores lots of chemical energy. This later energy can later be used to allow the plant to grow and grow and grow and grow, and then also reproduce to make seeds. So that's why if you look at our planet, they say our CO2 levels are increasing. One thing driving behind that is that we are reducing our vegetation to build homes, factories, roads. And so there's been a big push to add more plants to our surrounding planet to hopefully kind of scrub some of our CO2 levels that we have. Okay, so you can see here, this is just a good example, like again, quiz questions that I want you to know. This is why I think this will be fairly easy, but you can put these notes into your folder if you want to. If you want to print out the note packet or just write them on a piece of paper and then put it down too, it'd be perfectly fine. This kind of shows you where everything goes, when everything comes out. This is kind of just be careful because it shows the oxygen coming off the top of the plant when actually it's got to come out through the bottom. The stomatas are on the bottom of the plant. Okay, so here's what we looked at in class the other day. So you could see you don't need to know like guard cell, thick inner wall, nucleus, and chloroplast. I'm not too concerned with that, but what I want you to know is just these openings. We call this the lizard eye in class. That's what the students in the past have always called these because of kind of the pupil, how it's shaped, it looks like. But plants use this to get the CO2 into the cell and to release oxygen from the cell. So, and while water can enter the plant through the roots only. So this is where we can also kind of close these off to reduce how much fluid is lost too in water vapor in plants too. So like stomata will open in the light and close in the dark. However, stomatas can close in the middle of the day if water is limited. CO2 accumulates in the leaf or the temperature is too hot. So it's a way to kind of modify that. So in different types of, environments, more humid, less humid, we may see a uptick of more or fewer stomata. Now, transpiration is what we did with the celery in the class. So the celery, we did this where we had, I put celery and we put red dye and blue dye, depending on what class you had. But you could see where this was water also exists in the stomata. This process is called transpiration. When the surrounding air is drier than the plant, water evaporates from the plant. And so that's what you guys were really seeing is it was kind of as the water became evaporated from the plant, more was drawn up from the glass. So there's really kind of not a sucking kind of the plant pulling up that, but it's more of a push. The atmospheric pressure will push down on that fluid. It's kind of like a straw in a sense. When you pull the air out of that straw, atmospheric pressure will push that volume through the straw. And that's kind of what we see here. So small openings in the underside of the leaves are called stomata. So when the water evaporates from the leaf, water travels through. So this was the class demo. Now, again, this is a little bit of a repeat, but this is just kind of showing you where things come from. So here's kind of a good quiz question I use from time to time is I'll ask you, like, what happens to what atom turns into what? So, like, for example, if you're if you're generating water in a, process of cellular respiration, like, how does that work exactly? Like, how do you, or photosynthesis, like, how do you create that product? Well, this is how we can do this. So if you look at the hydrogen or the hydrogen atom here, and then you see this here, we know that, again, this is where this can be generated. So like, how do you make a water molecule? Well, that water molecule is going to come from something. So we can kind of combine these two here to be able to produce this. But like, for example, like the carbon in CO2 becomes part of the carbon in making of a glucose molecule. So for example, like the oxygens that you see here in photosynthesis are going to help to produce that of the oxygen over here. So again, this is kind of showing that transfer, and that's why all we're doing is rearranging the atoms to come up with different types of compounds. So I'll put that down. So we rearrange atoms to come up with that of different compounds. Okay, so kind of connecting everything together. Again, a little bit of repeat, but how does matter move in photosynthesis is something to think about for the quiz questions. And then CO2 can move into the stomata. That's what we talked about before, and where the water comes in from. So all of them are critical in photosynthesis. So if you take out any of the components, so if you have a plant that doesn't get water, the plant dies. Hopefully you now see that it's critical because part of that water is going to be necessary to kind of drive this system. So again, just like if you take out CO2 or you don't have sunlight. So if you put a plant that requires a lot of sunlight, you put it in the dark, it will start to wilt and start to die fairly quickly because it starves to death. It can't produce the glucose it needs, and that glucose is going to kind of fuel that growth. So if you can't fuel the growth, that plant has a tendency to die fairly quickly. Okay, so again, looking at kind of the matter process here, what's going in, what's going out. This is the term we haven't talked about since the lion and the elephants and the water buffalo, but biomass is going to be key here. So we want a lot of biomass. The more biomass we have, the more we can feed. And again, that's what's important for a farmer. So a farmer right now, if they have a poor crop yield, like in corn, he's not going to be able to feed his animals over the winter because he would have a low biomass. So that biomass is going to come from that plant production. So again, we could see where the main components are coming in, and again, where that's going to end up. And here's the last part here. Explain how energy changes in photosynthesis. This is kind of a perfect one right here. Like the banana tree will take that solar energy, that radiant energy, and turn into carbohydrates. The chemical energy and the carbohydrates stored in bananas. So if you eat a banana, that's when you eat it, there are calories in it. There's a biomass. There's carbohydrates in there in the form of glucose, and we can consume that for a food source. Now, you can see the monkey here is doing the same thing. Now, what's the monkey do with that energy is it now can contract its muscles. It can store this chemical energy, and it can move from place to place. Now, that muscle fiber full of muscle cells contract, converting chemicals into mechanical energy flow and heat flow. And again, we now turn it into kinetic. So we go from like that high potential energy to more kinetic energy, but you really learn that more in chemistry, or you're going to learn that in physics. Okay, so that's really it for today. You guys are going to be looking at this, the Amoeba Sisters and photosynthesis. That'll kind of be a good review for you. But remember, use this to study for Monday's quiz. Monday's quiz will be pretty general, but it'll be one that you guys can, I think, do pretty well with, because you can have open notes in it. And if you want to take some extra notes from the videos, that could be helpful. You can add that into your paper somewhere, okay? Okay, everybody, enjoy the rest of their day.